wanted to take a minute to talk about the additional cost functionality within Vicinity Brew to allocate costs, brewing costs, fermentation costs, packaging costs for a brewery. Specifically, I'm going to start in on the brewing process. I'm going to bring up my IPA brewing formula and we'll talk a little bit about the allocation of costs. In Vicinity Brew, you can have as many additional costs as you would like to add for a process. In this case, I'm keeping it very simple, and I've got a single cost called brew that I am applying to an individual brew. And in this case, my brew ID is brew, and it represents the brew house, and this would be the cost per brew that I'm interested in applying to a brew log. So every time I brew, I want to charge $250 per brew to a brew log. I can also determine which GL accounts I want to charge this to. This is basically a contra expense or a reduction of an expense account. So I've got labor overhead, utilities all going in as debits into my P&L. This would in effect go in as a credit to this GL account. I would typically recommend this account be an offset or a contra account. So an account set up in your P&L that is probably in the same area as labor, overhead, utilities, production costs, but I would separate that out probably as an account called applied labor brewhouse or something like that. And so you have your dollar amount, your GL account, and your ID. That's the most important part of this. And then you can apply it at a certain rate. I probably would go ahead and set this as 1. So I'm saying I want 1 unit of this per brew that I do, no matter how big the brew is. And that's defined by hours versus size of batch. So I would just set this up for 1 hours and it will apply 1 unit, in this case $250 per brew that I'm going to be doing. Now, there's nothing further that needs to be done from a setup perspective. When I go into a brew log, the user doesn't even have to know this is going on, but when a brew log is processed, these additional costs can be configured to automatically be added to the brew. So this is the same place I put it. Remember, I set my standard rate to 1. It can go ahead and automatically apply that issue now. So as I start consuming raw materials and start using ingredients, the system can automatically apply the cost of that labor overhead that we've got going in. So it would just automatically apply my 1 unit of labor, in this case my brew cost. It will add that $250 to my brew log itself and apply those costs as appropriate. So that's all that really needs to be done when you set up your brew house cost. Set up a brewing ID, apply a cost per brew by taking your total brew cost, divide by 365, or a number of brews in a year, I should really say, and that'll give you a cost per brew to be applied. Now let's look at the same concept for fermentation. It's basically the same thing, but with a little bit of a twist because not all beers ferment in the same time period. So what I would do here is I would create a additional cost ID. I created mine called fermentation. And when I set up that fermentation, I set up a cost per day of fermenter. So I take my total cellar cost, divide by the number of days, 365 in this case, divided by the number of fermenters, and that would give me a rate per day. Then I have an expense account that I would charge it to, or actually it's a contra expense account. Now the difference between fermentation and brew is right here. So what you would do here is put the standard fermentation time for this style of beer. So it would go in and automatically apply 14 units of fermentation to a fermentation log. Again, when I get into fermentation, user doesn't even know this is going on. The system can automatically apply that additional cost to my fermentation. So right here on my fermentation, here's my fermentation with 14 hours. It's applying that automatically. If I want to, I could come in and change that. If it took 16 days rather than 14 days, I could apply that. But the system can be set up to automatically apply that, and therefore those costs, in this case $700, is being applied to this fermentation log.